been about 400 years since the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth Rock. But are we still upholding the principles that the pilgrims came here to build our country upon? I thought we'd talk about that with Joseph Loconte, who is director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies and with the Family Foundation Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Loconte, welcome to the program.
Well, Lars, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me. And just so you know, it's Italian. It's Loconte, Italian-American. You turned me into a Frenchman there.
Oh, well, see, I got the emphasis on the wrong syllable. So sorry about that. I didn't mean to do that.
No, that's fine. Loconte is fine. You're doing this fine.
Well, I have Italian friends, so I don't want to mess them up either.
Very
tell
good.
me this. There are times when people have beliefs about what certain folks hundreds of years ago stood for. Do we understand the principles that the pilgrims believed in? And is that really the bedrock of our country? And are we still practicing that today?
Fabulous questions, Lars. I think the answer to the first question is sadly no. I would say most Americans don't understand what the Pilgrims accomplished, the principles they laid down. They're not familiar, really, even with our constitutional system of government anymore. This is true. It's true across so many sectors of society. And I think it's really important that you're taking some time in your program to help your listeners to kind of reflect on the amazing achievement of these pilgrims in 1620, the Mayflower Compact. It's an astonishing document.
It is, but in simple terms, you could talk to most grade school kids and they'd say, well, the pilgrims were I guess we'd call it religious persecution. They were the subjects of religious persecution, and they said, fine, we'll leave and we'll go somewhere else and we'll create a community that is free from religious persecution. Now, there are certainly examples of religious persecution in the United States, even after the United States was formed. But we've worked with an aspirational goal of getting rid of that, right?
Yes, exactly right. And I think there's a debt there to the Pilgrims, which the founding fathers took note of. What's the debt? It's a very short document, the Mayflower Compact. When they composed it and signed it, they did under real pressure because their own community of about 102 people, they weren't all separatists trying to flee the Church of England. More than half of them weren't as religiously motivated. They were more commercially motivated. So they had real fractures potentially in the community. So what do? They come together and agree, we're going to submit ourselves to laws that we ourselves write. We call that self-government. Yes, they were still honoring the king. They were still under his authority. But here, where they were going to land eventually there in Plymouth, the laws we write are going to govern this community. And how they described them was just and equal laws applied to everybody. In other words, the principle of equal justice under the law. That's not bad.
Joseph Loconte. Joseph Loconte, the Italian, makes the point. So they imagined way before John Adams ever talked about a nation of laws, not a nation of men, that they would write a set of rules, it would apply to everybody, and it wasn't just whether or not you were buddies with the governor or the mayor or whatever.
Yes, that's exactly right. Now, we want to be clear about some of this. Not everyone was invited to sign that document. The women were excluded, which is unfortunate because they would do so much to keep the colony alive in the following bitter winter months. But most of the men are able to sign it, no matter what their station of life is. So when the founders are looking for examples of self-government, they look right there at the earliest beginnings of the country in 1620. And that's really important now because we're having, of course, a debate launched by the New York Times and their 1619 project launched a year ago to discredit the American founding, to discredit the roots of the American political order. And they want to make the founding 1619 when slaves were first brought to these shores, enslaved Africans. Well, it's just so far from the truth in terms of understanding the remarkable democratic achievements of this country.
And in simple terms, Mr. Loconte, couldn't we indict every single civilization that's ever existed on Earth? Because there's been slavery among human beings on every continent, in virtually every single country on the planet. And in fact, slavery is still practiced in some areas today. And in fact, I would even argue that sex trafficking of either children or adults is a modern equivalent of that. which
Yes.
to some extent, sadly, society doesn't do enough about. But if that was the founding, then you're indicting every society, saying every human society is flawed then, isn't it? By that logic?
That's precisely right. This is where Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the author of this tirade, this diatribe that she's contrived at the New York Times. You'd never know that slavery was a universal human problem. Every civilization on the planet. I actually function as an historian. That's my credit card, if you will. That's my calling card. I'm one of those professional historians who got minted as an historian. So I do know something about the history of the West and the history of other civilizations. And you're absolutely right. It's this universal human problem. And the amazing thing, not only about Plymouth and the Pilgrims, but then, of course, the American revolutionaries who follow in their steps, is they declare that human slavery now is going to be put on notice. That's the great culmination of the Declaration of Independence, isn't it? Human slavery. The idea of enslaving and subjugating other human beings, that concept is now put on notice with the American Revolution.
And I guess where I get frustrated with people say, but it wasn't they hadn't achieved that yet. And I said, no, it was an aspirational document. It's like talking to an 18-year-old high school student and saying, what are you going to do? And he or she says, I'm going to be a doctor. Yeah. And if I turned around and said, but you're not one right now, are you? his parents and all my friends would think, well, what a boorish thing to say. He aspires to be a doctor, and it'll take some work, and he'll probably get there eventually. America is the same, isn't it?
That's exactly right, Lars. I mean, I think what we have here, particularly on the progressive left, we have a collection of very emotionally immature, embittered utopians. They want the world to exist and function in a certain way according to the utopian dreams, and it doesn't. It never does anywhere. And the amazing thing about the American story is the way in which we are always striving for a more perfect union, a more just society, a more humane and just society. But all that's swept aside by the left. That's why it's important to pause and remember what those brave men and women did crossing the Atlantic in this miserable trip across the Atlantic, seeking some measure of religious freedom for themselves. Maybe not for everybody else, but certainly for themselves, the idea of the importance of freedom of conscience before God. It wasn't a theocratic mission these guys were on, but it was a sort of human liberty mission. And that's worth stopping and thinking about here on these shores.
Mr. Loconte, one of the things about that is that it would have been very easy to imagine a group of people saying, since we've been oppressed and our religion was not allowed, we want to go somewhere and set it up so that only our religion is allowed, no competitors. You could imagine people doing that very easily, but they didn't. They thought broader than that.
Yeah, I think that's true. America has had its examples of a more hard-line militant religion. It's not like we've been completely free of that because it's a human problem. But what the Pilgrims did was, because they were a mixed bag, as I say, about 40 of the 102 or so of these pilgrims were really pilgrims. Were really kind of the saints, they call themselves. But 60 or some odd of them, they're not, quote-unquote, saints. They're not so religiously zealous that they want to leave the Church of England. So they have to accommodate the people who signed this contract. There's no doctrinal statement you have to make there. You're part of the community if you're willing to submit to these just and equal laws. Well, so there's an example, an early example of religious pluralism right there in that community. And not much like that existed outside of the United States. There's pockets of it in Europe, but they're not going anywhere for a long time.
No, they're not. Where can people read more about what you've written on this, Mr. Loconte?
Well, you can look me up over there at heritage.org, or on my website, www.josephloconte.com.
Very good. Mr. Loconte, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much, and thanks for being the historian that you have been.